Hey, my third grade friends, it's Mrs. Real here with another installment of Samantha Spinner and the Super Secret Plans. So last we left Samantha and her brother Nipper, they were in Paris because they'd taken the mag train that they found that goes underneath. And while they were learning about why they were there or how they got there, they were trying to buy a loaf of bread, and all of a sudden Ninja Dude shows up and starts throwing ninja stars at them. Some smelly ninja dude, as a matter of fact. And while running away from him, they kind of clobbered him, and they got away from him. And they were going back to the place where they had come up from the mag train tunnel, and there were a couple other ninja dudes hanging around there. So they disappeared to another spot, jumped over a wall where they could sit in the grass and not be seen, looked in the umbrella, and realized that there was another tunnel they could get to, or another spot they could get to in the Eiffel Tower, or under the Eiffel Tower, that looked like it would be taking them to Italy. Quite the travels they're having. And then our book that keeps giving us random pages of fun facts about different places gave us a little bit more information about the Louvre Museum. I don't speak French. I'm not good at that. I'm not fabulously great at Spanish, but I'm much better at that than I am French. So they talked about the fancy museum, just like they talked about the Eiffel Tower at the beginning of our story. And something else in the middle. So they're on quite the adventures. Oh, the VHSR plan, very high-speed railways, the mag train thing. All right, so we are at chapter 12, up, down, and out. So if you remember from the information about the Eiffel Tower at the very, very beginning of this book, we're like, why are they talking about the Eiffel Tower clear back here? One of those brads is actually a button, and that showed up on the umbrella. So up, down, and out. Samantha and Nipper jogged along the banks of the River Seine to the park with the Eiffel Tower standing near its northwestern end. As they made their way through the broad green expanse, Samantha took a moment to look around. I can't believe we're actually in Paris, she said to Nipper. Yeah, he replied. He looked back over his shoulder to see if any ninjas were behind them. Let's get out of Paris as soon as we can. Samantha felt a jab from the throwing star in her pocket. Nipper was right. They needed to get home safely and figure out what was going on. Are you eating something? She asked him. Nipper's mouth was full. He held out a handful of ninja cut bread cubes he picked up from the sidewalk. Oh, yuck, she exclaimed. It's actually quite delicious, he mumbled as they continued running through the park. Soon they reached the base of the tower. Visitors, tour guides, souvenir vendors, and street performers milled about the wide space between the four massive legs. A long line of people talked and snacked and snapped photos as they waited to ride the elevator to the top. Over there, Samantha said, pointing. We're taking the stairs. Nipper stopped in his tracks. He tilted his head back and stared up at the tower. It was over 1,000 feet high. His arms fell limp at his sides. Relax, said Samantha. We're only going to the first landing. Nipper counted the 2 platforms on the tower before it curved upward into the sky. Then he counted 14 flights of stairs leading up to the first one. Okay, he said, I guess it's better than being attacked by ninjas. Samantha had to agree. She skirted the people in line for the elevator and headed for the stairs. There didn't seem to be anyone taking tickets just then, so they walked through the turnstile without stopping. Side by side, they marched up the stairs. Clang, clang, clang. The metal echoed under their feet as they climbed, zigging and zagging up the endless staircase. At each new landing, the many gaps between the rails and beams of the complex structure grew larger. Samantha and Nipper started to catch glimpses of the city below. Flight after flight they rose until they reached the first platform. As they stepped out onto it, the beautiful city of Paris unfolded beneath them. The River Seine surrounded them on 3 sides. To their right, they saw the distant spires of the Grand Cathedral, Notre Dame de Paris, rising from an island in the middle of the Seine, and far off they could see the great avenue leading to the Arc de Triomphe, the giant stone Victory Arch. They stood silent for a moment, taking in the glorious view and catching their breath from the long climb. As Samantha gazed down at the park below, she spotted a line of 4 black dots moving toward the base of the tower. Sightseeing tour's over, she told her brother. Find the R. Nipper nodded, and they began inspecting the platform, winding their way around tourists who surveyed the scene below. Samantha scanned the beams that made up the mighty tower. There were small, round bumps on every surface, the rivets that held the structure together. Over here, Nipper called. He stood beside one of the large slanted girders that formed the tower's northernmost leg. He was pointing to a group of rivets at knee height on the painted metal surface. Samantha looked to her left and right to see if any of the tourists were paying attention to her or her brother. No one had noticed them at all. Then she crossed the platform to investigate. R marks the spot, said Nipper. All around the tower, rivets ran in straight lines and X-shaped patterns. In this one small area, however, about 30 rivets formed a large letter R. One rivet in the top corner of the cluster wasn't painted. Instead, it was shiny and silver. Nipper was pointing at that very rivet. I think it's a button, he said. Be careful, Samantha cautioned. Before you press it, we should try to... Before she could finish, Nipper reached out with his index finger and pushed the button. There was a loud click. She started again. We should try to figure out what... Several loud thumps came from deep inside the pillar. Never mind, she said. A soft, low humming sound began. They waited for a little while. The hum continued, but nothing happened. Nipper pushed the button again. This time, the humming stopped. He reached out once more and pushed the button. The click, thumps, and hum happened again. He pushed the button again, and the noises stopped. Now it's my turn, Samantha announced, nudging her brother out of the way before he could get in another press. Samantha pressed the button, and they heard the same pattern of noises. Nipper was about to reach out and press the button again, but Samantha grabbed his finger. Can we please wait and see what happens, she said, annoyed. The hum continued. Samantha counted to 10 and let go of Nipper's finger. They both waited while the sound went on for a full minute. Finally it stopped, and there was a loud clunk and the sound of grinding gears. A panel in the girder swung out toward them like a refrigerator door. Samantha looked around and was again surprised to see that no one else on the platform seemed to notice a thing. Everybody was simply too busy gazing out at the surrounding view of Paris to look at the Eiffel Tower itself. Samantha turned back to the door and peered over her brother's shoulder into the opening. Inside was a hollow shaft, about 4 feet from side to side. It sloped down to the left at an angle that followed the tower's leg and disappeared out of sight. On the wall to the right of the door, a metal ladder ran up and down. Do you think we should just climb in? Nipper said. Not that I'm scared, but well, it's really dark in there. Samantha opened her mouth to answer, and a cloud of stink hit her. The scent of glue, moldy peanut butter, and 100 uncapped whiteboard markers filled the air. Samantha looked at Nipper. Hands over their noses, they ran to the staircase they'd just climbed and peered over the railing. 4 figures dressed in black were making their way up the tower. They were only 3 flights away from where the Spinners stood on the first platform. I don't mind the dark so much, Nipper said quickly. He spun around and ran back toward the pillar. Samantha followed him to the pillar and got there just as he hopped through the opening, grabbed the ladder, and began to descend, disappearing rapidly. Samantha was right behind him. She paused for a moment to secure the umbrella over her shoulder. Then she stepped forward into the opening and grabbed a metal rung with both hands. Stop! Someone shouted. Don't move! Samantha couldn't help it. She turned around. She saw the same smelly ninja they'd encountered outside the Louvre just as he stepped onto the platform, and he was even filthier than before. He had a fresh layer of breadcrumbs covering his front from where he had fallen onto the sidewalk. Several wads of gum stuck to his shrouded face, including one big pink blob directly in the center of his forehead. The 3 other black-clad figures stood a few feet behind him, and they were just as dirty. Her brother's voice drifted up from inside the shaft. Are you still coming, Sam? The ninja looked past Samantha into the shaft beyond. Hey boy, is that you? The crumb and gum covered ninja shouted to Nipper. Come back up here so we can finish that friendly chat we were having about... Samantha spotted a handle on the back of the iron door, grabbed it, and pulled the door shut as hard as she could. A loud clang reverberated up and down the shaft. She was in the dark. Samantha clung to the ladder in the silence. Suddenly, there was a tap, tap, tapping on the other side of the iron door. She stayed frozen, holding on tight to the metal rung, breathing out when it finally stopped. Then frantic pounding erupted. Then the pounding ended, and the muffled sound of 4 really unhappy ninjas yelling at each other trickled into the chamber. Samantha relaxed. I think we're safe, Nipper, she called downward. They saw the door, but I don't think they know about the secret button. Come on, she heard her brother shout. There's more light down here. Carefully, Samantha reached out her toe until she felt the next rung under her foot. She moved one hand at a time and began to follow her brother down the slanted shaft. As she descended, narrow slivers of light began to seep in through the edges of the structure, cutting through the darkness. Samantha could see the rungs of the ladder, and far below she saw her brother looking up, waiting for her. She could also feel a gentle breeze. At first she thought the air was coming through the same gaps as the light. As she continued, however, the breeze became stronger. She stopped and shifted her shoulder to make sure the umbrella was secure. Then she returned her downward climb. Sam, she heard her brother calling, this is getting weirder. He was about 20 feet below her. His hair was swirling around wildly. As she moved toward her brother along the ladder, the breeze grew stronger with every step. It was so windy that gusts of air whipped Samantha's hair in front of her face, and she had to move slower and with more care. It was getting harder to hear, and it took more and more strength to stay on the ladder. Sam! She heard Nipper shout over the sound of the rushing air. She was sure that he was only a few feet away. She lowered herself down one more rung and felt her shoe press into something soft and hand-like. Yow! Her brother screamed over the roar of the wind. She looked down to see him yank his hand out from under her foot. Then his other hand slipped off the ladder. For a split second, she saw her brother's startled expression as he frantically looked up, hands out, desperately trying to grab onto something. Then he was gone. Nipper! Sam screamed. She waited for a crash or a thump or some other terrible sound of an 8-year-old going splat. But there was nothing. Just the roar of the gale force winds that tugged at her like some giant invisible vacuum cleaner. She clung to the ladder with all her might. Her knuckles turned white as she strained to hang on. The shuriken slipped out of her front pocket. She heard it ricochet off a metal rung as it dropped away. She felt her journal slide slowly from her back pocket, but there was nothing she could do about it. Gone. She felt the umbrella slipping off her shoulder and down her right arm. She took her left hand from the rung to try to shove the strap back in place. A gust of air yanked at her with such force that she couldn't hold on with just one hand. And then she was airborne. Helplessly, Samantha fell. The mighty suction pulled her downward so fast that the ladder and the walls of the shaft became a blur. She gritted her teeth and waited for impact. And then her direction changed, and she was moving sideways. It was getting brighter. Curved walls shot past her on all sides. Every 10 yards or so, a ring of lights flush with the walls flashed past. It took her a moment, but she realized she was rocketing through a giant pneumatic tube. Remember the pneumatic tubes are the ones that are like at the bank when you go through the drive-thru and the air sucks things through the tube. She heard the sound of ruffling pages and something fluttered around her head. It was her journal. She snatched the book and shoved it back into her pocket. Far ahead of her, she could see Nipper. He waved to her with both hands as he zoomed along through the tube. In one hand, he held the ninja throwing star. Hey, Sam, he shouted cheerfully. I think you were right. I think we're on our way to Italy. I don't know, what do you guys think? Does it look like fun? Might be. All right, so the Mona Lisa. Here's our other random information that's going to show up, but kind of connected, because the Mona Lisa is the painting, one of the many paintings that's hanging in the Louvre Museum in Paris. So the Mona Lisa. The best known, most visited, most written about portrait in the world is a painting of a smiling woman by Leonardo da Vinci. It is an oil painting on a poplar wood panel. Most experts believe it is a picture of Lisa Gherardini, a woman who lived in Italy in the 1500s. Almost nothing else is known about her or her famous smile. The Mona Lisa has been on permanent display in the Louvre Museum in Paris since 1797. That's a long time. That's over 200 years. The directors of the Louvre have been covering up a secret for several years. Someone stole the Mona Lisa. Visitors who go to the famous museum to view the portrait are now staring at page 967 of Famous Art You Should Know from Around the World. No one has any idea where the real painting is or how thieves were able to break into the museum. There were no clues other than a terrible, terrible smell. French authorities, art experts, and customs agents have been searching the globe for the original masterpiece for many years. Every museum guard in the world secretly hopes to be the one who rescues the Mona Lisa. A terrible smell in Paris. Chapter 13, Underwear. Normally, Nipper was not the first person Samantha would want anywhere near her as she flew through a giant pneumatic tube. Yet there they were, sailing on a blast of pressurized air from France to Italy. Every now and then, they bumped into each other. "Watch out," said Samantha when his elbow glanced off her ear, but she knew there really wasn't much Nipper could do about it. There also wasn't much to see inside the long tunnel, but it sure zoomed by fast. Samantha wondered if Uncle Paul traveled by pneumatic tube. It didn't seem like a smart way to go, tumbling from place to place. And did he get chased from place to place too? The tube suddenly banked left and then right, and Samantha could feel herself slowing down. Then the tube curved up and over in a big loop-de-loop. "Crazy straw!" shouted Nipper. They did 2 more loops, and they slowed down a bit more each time. As the last of the pressurized air swirled around them, they tumbled out onto the floor of a small chamber, landing in a pile. "Not as smooth as the mag train," Samantha muttered as she untangled herself from her brother and got up off the floor. She spotted the umbrella and picked it up quickly. Nipper hopped to his feet beside her, and they looked around. They stood in the center of a narrow space, lit by torches on 3 of the 4 walls. The flickering light illuminated a checkerboard pattern in the large square floor tiles. "Here we go again," said Nipper. "Check the plans and see how many steps or stomps or skips we have to do to unlock the secret exit." Samantha walked to the large wooden door in front of them and turned the handle. She pushed the door open slowly, and light flooded the room. "That works too," said Nipper, and he followed her outside. They stepped out into a wide plaza surrounded by ornate buildings and towers. A cathedral with a gigantic 8-sided dome loomed over them. Samantha recognized their location immediately. Night after night, Uncle Paul had talked about the Italian Renaissance, a time of great artists and architects. The huge terracotta-tiled dome was the top of the Duomo, the great Florence Cathedral. They were standing in the historic center of Florence, Italy. Samantha gazed up at a high structure next to the cathedral. It was a slender square tower covered in white, green, and red marble and decorated with row upon row of arches, pillars, sculptures, and colorful shapes. She remembered her uncle looking upward and waving his hands happily as he described the bell tower. Guys, I have to tell you, I've been to this part of Italy. I've been stayed next to the Duomo in Florence. It's beyond amazing and beautiful. So it would be really fun if we could just jump into a tube and get there really fast to see it, because it would be amazing. Then she looked around the plaza. There were statues and fountains and, of course, visitors from around the world. Everyone was excited and looking up and down and sideways. Samantha could tell that many of them were having trouble deciding what to see first. Nipper tapped her on the shoulder and held out the ninja throwing star. "Get us home before more of these start flying at us," he said, and handed it to her. Of the many places she'd heard about from Uncle Paul, Florence was high on the list of cities she'd hoped to visit one day. Now she was there, and she already had to leave. "How long do you think we have until the ninjas get here?" asked Nipper. "I don't know if they followed us," said Samantha, "and I'm not even sure how they found us in the first place." She took the star from him and adjusted the umbrella on her shoulder. Then she led him into the narrow alley that ran between the Duomo and the bell tower. If there were ninjas around, she didn't want to draw their attention. She knelt down, opened the umbrella, and took the magnifying glass from Nipper and began to look for a way home. She couldn't find any lines pointing to the mailbox in Seattle, but next to the little boot shape of Italy, she saw a letter U with a number 16 in its center. A wavy line from the U led across the lining, back to the France shape, and connected with the dotted mag train line. What could that possibly mean? Asked Nipper, kneeling and peering over her shoulder. Well, what starts with you? She asked him. Underwear, said Nipper quickly. Then he rubbed his chin and continued slowly. Unusual uncle, unexplained umbrella, uptown umpires, unfortunately unseen unless. Samantha took a closer look at the letter U and noticed that there were 4 tiny white dots on each side. Hold on, she said. It's a horseshoe. Okay, said Nipper, rising to his feet. Let's go find a horse and kick it 16 times and... Nipper, she cut him off. First, that's awful. And second, that's a horse's shoe. So maybe you get kicked 16 times. She stood up, closed the umbrella, and led him back onto the plaza. They walked around the outside of the cathedral looking for a horse statue or a horse painting or even a real live horse. They noticed a tall man standing on the steps of the Duomo, watching them closely. Leave this to me, said Nipper. He walked up to the man. Hey, he shouted. He looked back at Samantha and winked. Then he started waving at the man and began to speak very slowly and loudly. Is there a horse here? Expressionless, the man stared at him. Horsey? Yes? Nipper continued. Giddy up! He held up his fists as if they were hooves. Then he began to prance around the man, stomping his feet in rhythm. Nay, 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 he whinnied and shook his head from side to side while blowing loudly through his flapping lips. Samantha grabbed her brother by the shoulder and stopped him. That's my brother, she said, rolling her eyes. He wants to know if there's a horse nearby, or maybe a statue of a horse. I know, young lady, the man said in English, but that was hilarious. He chuckled and pointed past them to a corner of the plaza. The Plaza de la Signoria is that way, he said. Very famous place with very famous sculptures. They gazed across the plaza. Many people were entering and exiting. Samantha turned back toward the man. Grazie, she said. Prego, he replied, and nodded warmly. So remember, she knows how to say thank you. And he said, you're welcome, in Italian. Samantha and Nipper walked to the edge of the plaza and followed the throng. Couples holding hands, parents with kids, and tour groups in matching t-shirts all funneled into the street beyond. How did you know that guy spoke English? Nipper asked as they moved into the crowd down the cobblestone street. He was wearing a badge that said museum security, she answered. He probably talks to visitors from around the world all day long. Samantha thought about Olivia Turtle, the guard at the museum in Seattle. She could probably name all the statues in Florence, just like Uncle Paul. 5 blocks later, the street opened onto a vast L-shaped plaza. Statues, vendors, and even more visitors filled the expanse. Samantha and Nipper stopped and gazed up at a stone fortress. It was a square, 8-story castle with a tall clock tower perched on top. Then they looked down again to the street and the entrance to the massive stone building. Just to the left of the fortress door, they saw a huge white statue, almost 20 feet high. It was a young man, completely nude. He held a sling over his shoulder and looked off in the distance with a wary expression on his face. I know that one, said Nipper proudly. That's David. Michelangelo's David, Samantha added. Last year, Paul had given the Spinner family a magnet set. It included a magnet depicting the famous statue of the biblical King David by the artist Michelangelo. Plus shirts, boxer shorts, hats, and a lot of other funny clothes to stick on it and dress it up. It was on their refrigerator right now. Everyone still took turns switching the clothes around. Samantha looked farther to the left, over to the corner of the fortress where a fountain bubbled. A giant stone man wearing a crown, and nothing else, stood on a pedestal in the center of a wide octagonal pool. The Fountain of Neptune, said Samantha. Whenever Uncle Paul talked about Florence, he talked about Michelangelo's David, and he always mentioned the Fountain of Neptune too. Samantha looked down at the feet of Neptune, the god of the sea. 4 enormous marble horses appeared to splash in the water. 16 horseshoes, said Samantha, nodding confidently. So 4 horses have 4 feet each. 4 times 4 would be 16 horseshoes. She led Nipper to the edge of the fountain. Stone walls 3 feet high formed an octagon. At the corners were bronze statues of men, women, fish, and what she guessed were Roman gods. The statue in the center was enormous, even taller than Michelangelo's David. Neptune stood on a pedestal with circles on 2 sides, so it looked as if the horses were pulling him along in an underwater chariot. Samantha took a closer look at the horses. From the edge of the pool, they seemed to be splashing and straining as they hauled Neptune through the water. Their mouths were open, as if gasping for air. Each horse pointed in a different direction. She looked even closer and noticed something odd. As she leaned forward over the fountain wall and stared at the bright marble faces, she saw a blue dot in one horse's nostril. "There's something up with that horse," she told her brother, pointing. "Follow me into the fountain." "I'm in," he said, and climbed up onto the wall ahead of her. Then he hopped into the water and waited. Samantha wasn't as eager to go into the pool. She pulled herself up onto the stone wall and stopped to look back. She had been in this amazing historic city for less than an hour and had spent the entire time looking for a way to leave. Now the umbrella had led her to a mysterious dot in the middle of a horse's nose in the middle of a fountain. In the many times she had thought about visiting the beautiful city of Florence, this was not what she'd had in mind. There were museums and cathedrals and historic palaces, and she was jumping into a fountain to find the quickest way home. It wasn't fair. She clutched the umbrella tightly as she hopped into the water and waded past Nipper toward the statues. Water bubbled gently around them. "Hey," said Nipper, gazing down at the floor of the pool. "There's money everywhere." He knelt down and began to scoop up a handful of shiny coins. Samantha turned back and grabbed his arm. "It's not yours," she said. "Those coins get collected for charity, and we're in the fountain to get out of here, remember?" Nipper frowned for a moment. Then he nodded and stood back up, leaving the money where it was. They splashed through the waist-deep water toward the center of the pool. Samantha looked around. No one in the plaza had noticed them yet. She wasn't sure how long it would take before somebody did. "Do you think this is where Uncle Paul's money came from?" Nipper asked, splashing behind her. "His letter mentioned underwater treasure. There are a lot of fountains around the world." "I don't think so," said Samantha. "Didn't he say something about gold bars? Who throws gold bars into a fountain?" Samantha abruptly stopped walking and Nipper ran into her. They'd come face to face with the 4 bright white marble stallions. She looked back at Nipper as she pointed to the face of the horse second from the right. Nipper squinted at the horse for a moment. Then he stood up straight. "Step aside," Nipper said loudly, pushing his sister out of the way. He raised a hand high in the air and wiggled his index finger. "This is a noseworthy situation," he declared, as if addressing an audience, "and I have been called upon to use my special talent." Samantha groaned. "Even in Florence, Italy, you are exceptionally gross." Nipper plunged his finger deep inside the horse's dark nostril and pressed. Something gave, a little, and there was a click, followed by 4 loud, low, creaking noises. Somewhere deep below the street, it sounded like 4 giant toilets were flushing. Samantha and Nipper both looked down. The water directly beneath the horse's feet began to froth. Nipper took one big step backward to where Samantha stood. "My work here is done," he announced proudly, and folded his arms. The water around the horses began to churn. It looked as if the marble herd was stampeding. Samantha and Nipper inched back a bit more as the water started whipping more strongly and began to lap against the walls of the fountain. "Ouch," said Nipper, as a wave tossed one of the coins from the bottom of the fountain and smacked him hard on the cheek with it. Both kids took another step back. "Maybe we should get out of the pool for a minute," Nipper said nervously, rubbing his face where the coin had hit him. But Samantha was staring at the horse's feet. A dark shape had appeared in the swirling water in front of them. Nipper reached for his sister's hand, but she had already taken another big step back. Samantha turned and looked out from where they stood in the fountain. Several visitors around the plaza had begun to notice the watery spectacle. "Mommy, it's a water show!" a boy wearing a New York Yankees t-shirt shouted, pointing at them. "Prego!" And I don't know what the rest of that says because it's in Italian. "Non più parlaci." wailed a woman standing next to him. Samantha started to lose her footing. The fountain had become an angry squall. Wait, she shouted to Nipper above the chaos. I just remembered something Uncle Paul told us about David. That one's a copy. The real one is in the The current yanked Samantha under the surface, ending her sentence in a gurgling ee. She was being sucked toward the dark shape in front of the horses. She flailed her arms, slapping at the water helplessly, and slid into darkness. And I can't just leave them there, so guys, I'm going to read one more chapter. Chapter 14 is called Slip and Slide. The mag train ride to Paris had been smooth sailing. The pneumatic tube to Italy had been a bumpy tumble. Now, unexpectedly, Samantha faced a bruising Class 4 whitewater challenge. She dropped through the hole in the Fountain of Neptune, fell for about 5 feet, and landed with a splat on a narrow half-pipe track. Fountain water and coins rained down on her. A shallow but powerful current swept her forward. Seconds later, she heard a splash and a thump as Nipper plopped down behind her. The current grew stronger, and the rushing water propelled them along. The track became steeper, and they rocketed down the slide. They banked left and right, spiraling downward and bouncing off the walls of the U-shaped track. Samantha clutched her umbrella close to her body and shut her eyes. For a while, she coasted along on her back. Then the current tossed and flipped her, and she was sliding head first. Water seemed to blast at her from all directions. "Holy cowabunga!" her brother shouted. She opened her eyes just in time to see that the slide curved upward and ended with a ramp, spraying its contents into a giant funnel. "Yow!" she shouted as she careened up and out of the half-pipe track and sailed through the air. Samantha plunged into the funnel. Seconds later, she heard Nipper splash down behind her. She caught a glimpse of him every few seconds as they both swirled around and around in a vortex of water and foam. It dragged her to the center of the funnel. Then there was an incredibly loud pop. She shot through a tube at the bottom, and everything went white. Samantha couldn't see anything but bubbles. She focused on her breathing as she rocketed along inside a bullet of foam. Slowly, the bubbles began to clear. She was back on a water slide. She coasted along again for what must have been minutes, but seemed like hours. Then the track made an extra sharp turn and flung her out of the water. She bumped into a wall and tumbled down another dark slide. Thump! Amanda fell out onto a damp stone floor. Thump! Nipper spilled onto the floor beside her. They both lay there quietly for a while, stunned, soggy, and sore. Nipper sat up first. He shook his head from side to side. Then he did it 5 more times. It reminded Samantha of Dennis. "This is the last time we go whitewater rafting without a raft," she said. She looked down and saw her fist clenched around the red umbrella. She'd been gripping it tightly the whole time. She eased up, but didn't let go. She rose to her feet carefully, using the umbrella to prop herself up. The floor below them was a pattern of large tiles. Samantha recognized it immediately. "France?" Nipper asked. Samantha nodded. The water slide had dumped her and Nipper back into the room under the Louvre. A few yards away, they could see a blinking red dot. "Mag train. Home," she said. They walked carefully toward the faint light, their shoes squishing on the floor with every step. The glowing dot was the oval button near the center seat of the mag train car. They climbed aboard the familiar car and took their places. Samantha tapped the button, and the tiny hairs on her arms stood up. The rails began to glow, and she and Nipper sped away through the tunnel. Samantha pushed some soggy hair away from her face and leaned back in the seat. Her neck and her arms were sore from the water ride. If giant pneumatic tubes weren't a smart way to travel, then international water slides were completely stupid. Then she looked over at the umbrella resting against the rail. It was full of secrets and danger and pointless pain and aggravation. Did Uncle Paul really think he was giving her a present? So far, it had gotten her bounced around, soaked, bruised, and almost sliced by ninjas. Maybe the smelly ninjas were planning to kill whoever had the umbrella, and that's why he'd passed it to her and run away. "Thanks a lot, Pajama Paul," she said softly. Samantha figured they had about 20 minutes before they would be back in Seattle. She took out her notebook and inspected it. It was damp on the outside, but the pages inside were still dry. She began to write. If someone puts you in grave danger, and then you have to leave the beautiful city of Florence in a hurry, look for Neptune's fountain. Wade into the water, up to the statue with 4 horses. Face the second horse from the right, and stick your finger in his nose. And I will stop us there. I don't know about you guys, but I am really liking this story, and I can't wait to see what happens next. So she is not very excited. She was kind of excited to find out that the umbrella wasn't just an old umbrella like she thought. There's this map and all these secret things, but then the secret things turned into some kind of dangerous situations. And while the mag train sounds awesome, and I could even do the pneumatic tube, better than flying squished up in an airplane, I couldn't do the water one. That I think would be too crazy. So I'm going to keep reading. I'm going to keep posting it to the videos to the YouTube channel. It's on the 3rd grade playlist. Keep following along. Even though if school's officially over, I'm still going to finish the story because I need to know what happens. And I really need to know if I could take that mag train to Paris or Italy or any place, because that sounds like the cool way to travel. I will see you soon again, my friends.